we are live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and our topic today is LNG projects around the world. And it's a pleasure having Professor Cleveland Jones. Professor Cleveland Jones, this is the LinkedIn page of Professor Cleveland Jones. He is a researcher and a very famous advisor for geopolitics in the energy industry. Good evening, Professor.
Nice to be with you again, Kavanya. This should be fun.
It's a great pleasure. Professor, someone blew up the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia to Germany
Yeah,
2 or 3 years ago. Someone, I don't know who, but someone did it. This pipeline was planned to transport more than 400,000 cubic meters per day. Immediately after that, this gas was replaced by LNG from United States and something like that. So, and now, Professor, could you please explain us how are the market, LNG
yeah,
market around the world?
yeah. The Ukraine war and that event in particular was kind of a very special turning point in the LNG world because LNG had already assumed a global market presence and expanding by having a lot of capillarity. But the war and the pipeline explosion or sabotage, whatever you want, that put it very clear terms. The U.S. is the dominant LNG player, and when we talk, like in this program, LNG projects around the world, as you'll see, LNG around the world basically is U.S. LNG and maybe a couple others, and
There's
this is
Qatar.
yeah, but this is becoming more and more clear that this is what the world will see. The LNG and natural gas consumption in general has gone up quite a bit because, as you know, natural gas is a preferred fuel. Obviously, it loses in terms of cost advantages, maybe to coal and something like that. But it is very clear that it is very competitive, especially from some sources such as the U.S. So, even though Europe, for example, gains some, loses some, is more or less the same, but other regions in the world are steaming ahead in LNG and natural gas consumption. Let me show just one more graph here. Net global LNG supply additions. LNG is streaming forward. It doesn't depend on Trump saying drill baby drill. The market is driving this. It's not government policy. It's not some demand policies from countries. It's the market that is driving this, and the growth in the next 3 or 4 years is tremendous.
Yeah, Jorge Oliveira from Portugal is saying exactly this way. Drill, baby, drill from Trump today,
Yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah. So I can understand that maybe we will see less restrictions, obviously the lifting of the moratorium on the LNG projects and so on. But most of the big projects are on schedule. When this reversal occurs, all the other projects that were stopped, they basically didn't lose any time. So we're on schedule to bring in all the LNG projects that were going to be brought on anyway. The market
But
defines that.
please let me first. Boa noite, good evening, Jorge Oliveira,
Good.
Eduardo França, and there's a question from CO2, I suppose. Yeah, carbon emission. We can postpone a little bit, but from Pedro Moura.
I
Let
will
me
answer
ask.
that.
Yeah, do not forget to answer Pedro Moura.
Yeah.
Let me ask you. So the 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 Nord Stream pipeline was blew up, and the reason was something related to the excess of production of LNG from natural gas from the United States.
I won't go into that, Kavaya, because really I think there's quite a few good explanations that sound like conspiracies, but they're very real because, when you are involved in geopolitics and very strong, valuable interests between countries, and blocks, anything can happen. But I think that we can focus on the consequences, and the
Yeah, that's right.
consequences are very real and very lasting. Because if there was a desire from the Western Bloc, for example, to prevent Russian gas exports, they haven't been totally successful because Russia is still exporting gas. But, it opened up a tremendous opportunity for the US and other LNG exporters to fill a very significant gap. And only recently, and I talked this when we talk about Russia, only recently have sanctions really hurt Russia. They haven't hurt so far, almost at
Yeah.
all. But now, especially for LNG, they are impactful. And that's almost the only place because, they're selling oil and pipe gas. They have big projects for pipe gas to China and so on. And those will go forward slowly because sanctions still have some bite.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. You have several slides here. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Global LNG supply and demand certainly will go up a lot. We're talking, almost a trillion uh, cubic meters a year. This is a market that is so global and so market driven that it is not one country that says, "Oh, we won't burn natural gas or LNG." Doesn't matter. Western Europe or any other country that wants to be clean and decide not to burn gas, or any other country that wants to really develop its gas resources, like I mentioned Argentina, they are not the drivers. The driver is market penetration because of capillarity in a lot of countries that import LNG as a natural gas supply to meet their demands in a very cost effective way. Considering cost, LNG, even though it's extremely more expensive than in the US, it is still a relatively cheap energy source in relation to even oil and other energy alternatives for many countries. And it's
And
great.
how do you compare prices for
Yeah,
natural gas and LNG
yeah.
per
Okay.
cubic meter?
Yeah. LNG is going to be more expensive because it has significant liquefaction and,
Ship
regas
traveling.
costs, transportation costs, and so on. But for the countries that are importing LNG, it serves a very crucial energy supply need. And it also is a very quick solution because building pipelines is a multi-year project. Uh, a ship can just take LNG from one end to the other. And if you have a floating LNG or a regas facility, in under 1 year, you can be set up to import or export gas. This is a reality that we had not even conceived of. 10 years ago, we were still worried about how LNG is going to take hold and so on. Now it's just unstoppable.
Yeah,
And
because
yeah,
sorry.
no,
No, no, I was saying that the price for natural gas in the United States is
yeah,
$2.883 per million
less than three, and it
BTU.
was a lot cheaper. And maybe it will still remain in that bound area there. Even if there's an increasing supply and prices go down, demand even within the United States is likely to go up, and also exports. And also something that I will show when I talk about North America. Um, Let me just show one other thing
Sure,
here.
sure.
Uh, the trade volume is going up. It's not just that the U.S. is producing LNG and it's consuming it. No, it's exporting. And sure, there are many countries that can benefit, say, from globalization of LNG trade, but the trade itself is the major driver of LNG demand because
But
countries.
what do you mean as trade? It's not only import. Is exactly what is this?
Well, this is all the LNG that the U.S. and West Africa and everybody else produces and gets sold to China and wherever. And this is even more steep than the actual production of natural gas because LNG is taking up a larger share of natural gas uh, production and consumption as LNG instead of pipe gas or otherwise.
1.6 billion cubic meters per day is a great volume. Brazil's Brazil's production is 100
Yeah, less.
million.
So, you're talking about 16 times Brazilian gas consumption just in trade. And this is more now because this is 2023, and the growth is going to be exponential. So we're talking very large numbers. And if you look at regionally, geographically, sure, there's imbalances in Europe and Asia that consume more than they produce. But this uh, spread of production and demand makes it so that LNG trade can grow very much, because in many cases it is very competitive even with the large distances from the US to Asia, or from West Africa to Europe, and so on. Very competitive. And LNG transport is really not so expensive, because oftentimes you end up burning blow off gas as fuel, so you almost don't lose too much.
Mhm. Good.
But look, these trade routes have been established, and they're just going to grow. Obviously, they're going to grow to China, India. The big demand growth is going to be in these countries. But the United States as a major producer, West Africa, and now East Africa, maybe some years from now, and certainly the Middle East will grow. Australia is close to the Asian markets, has big advantages and big disadvantages, which I'll talk about in a little while. And I showed this graph on another program. This shows that LNG prices have come to a point where they're relatively stable. This is attractive. It's not just how high or how low prices are, it's how volatile they are. And when they were very volatile back in 21, 22, and ending up in 23, LNG was scary, because you don't know, maybe you're going to have to pay 5 times more, which is happening. Nowadays, we're in a very stable price regimen, because it has grown so much that the market itself has found a balance for LNG prices. This is very positive.
So you mean you mean that the price of LNG follows oil
It,
price?
it follows it in general, but let's be clear, LNG is a separate commodity. And nowadays, I think we've seen this. It is more and more independent of oil and gas prices. And it's more and more related to what the market will bear, because some of these countries that import LNG, they would not import oil instead, because it's not appropriate for easy electricity generation from thermoelectric plants, for example. You need gas, and that's
But there is a let's say a correlation between these two price lines.
But if the correlation were to be with oil, natural gas is much more energy efficient than oil. So indeed,
Yeah.
LNG and natural gas still have a great advantage, BTU per percent per dollars. So it should be favored in terms of demand, because you can go a lot further with LNG imports in terms of electricity generation, or using as fuel, as opposed to oil.
Mhm.
But liquefaction capacity is also going up. But I want to point out some countries here. The fourth, Russia, it has this yellow bar. This is expected growth. Forget that. That's not going to happen. Australia, tiny little yellow growth. Australia is not growing. But of course, Qatar is growing. The US is growing a lot. And some other countries will grow, maybe from smaller levels. But it's important to see how the relative participation of some countries are really changing. And indeed, we're going to see the US dominate the LNG
And,
market even more.
and the 51st state of United States is totally additions, capacity additions. Canada.
Yeah, Canada will grow, but it will grow because of problems exporting gas to the US. So what does Canada have to do? It has to export its gas to alternative markets. And, Trump is a problem for Canada, and Canada has been, rightly so, looking west to export its gas to Asia. And it can do so because it has pipeline capacity coming on stream that it can significantly add capacity, but from a relatively low level because it's starting from zero, obviously.
Uh-huh.
But look, existing capacity all the way in some smaller countries. Even Egypt has capacity a little bit limited because of gas imports from Israel, which is what they export with. They export LNG based on gas imports from Israel. That has some political implications and also some, technical restrictions. But you can see that the big guys dominate. But here, there's a big, I would say, uh, wishful thinking. Russia,
Yeah.
in particular. Russia is not going anywhere for a good long time in LNG. The 40 or the 40 some million export capacity is going to be what it is, and it's not going to grow
Uh,
for quite some time.
Professor, Brazil does not appear in this in
No.
this chart, but appears in the oil production,
Yeah,
4%
yeah.
of the world.
Importantly,
What's the
yeah.
reason that Brazil is not strong in
Brazil
gas?
has been the has had a big problem with the tremendous oil production from the pre-salt with associated gas that has not been able to be monetized. So they just re-inject it. Maybe now with route number 3, some of that gas is going into the country. It's basically substituting imports from Bolivia and other places. But that is not going to change because even though it could be a tremendous gas producer, if all of the pre-salt gas were monetized, that depends on very expensive infrastructure projects, 350 mile pipelines from offshore production into Rio or Sao Paulo. That's going to take some years. So Brazil will not be a major player either as an exporter or an importer of LNG. It imports some LNG to meet thermoelectric power production, but minimal amounts in relation to other countries, and even Argentina, which doesn't even make it here yet. I comment on Argentina. That's not going to make the map here. If you look at where the action is, which I said is in North America, Canada, yes, out west, it will export some LNG, minor amounts, but the United States is the biggest producer. But look at the green. Green is Mexico, and Mexico is going into several LNG projects 100% with gas from the U.S. So it's going to take pipeline gas from the U.S. and turn it into LNG and then re-export it. So if you count that as Mexico, fine, because that's what Mexico is doing. But that's basically U.S. gas. If it weren't there, it would be somewhere in Louisiana or Texas or somewhere. So
And,
it's important to also understand that Mexico is a player, but it's a player based on U.S. gas.
and Brazil, do Brazil import LNG, and do we have regasification plants in
Yes,
Brazil?
we have several regas plants in the northeast states and in Rio and so on because they are there to meet peak demand seasonal, peak demand when hydroelectric power is in short supply because of seasonal rainfall shortages and so on. And that will continue. So Brazil will be more of a seasonal importer of LNG. It is not it's not an exporter because the country still consumes more natural gas than it produces. Even though it's still not a major consumer, industrialization depends on natural gas, and Brazil has gone through a large deindustrialization in its exports. So that has hurt natural gas demand. If it begins to reverse that trend and Brazil reindustrializes, which will take 3, 4, 5 years, then natural gas consumption would go up. And then we would have to see if that consumption will come from the pre-salt in time because of the Route 3 or Route 4 eventually, or if it will have to be made up with LNG. But still is not going to be a major import player. But you know, this is an updated graph. I've shown this several times, and each year we advance, 1 year in this graph with more bars. This shows, yes, Mexico's in the green there. The U.S. has a lot of capacity. Now we're very close to 190, maybe 200 million metric tons of LNG supplied to the world from U.S. and Mexico and some Canada. That is the elephant in the room, and people have to realize that if Trump is successful in debottlenecking some projects, even though I believe, of course, the market will do that, then this is set to grow even more. We're making forecasts of 2028, maybe 2030. This will go up because there's several other projects there that are ready to go. If they get FIDs, the go ahead, they can be put online in very few years. Okay, so enough to say that the U.S. is a big player. It's going to double 200 million tons a year, and projects that are in pre-construction. The growth is just incredible. Many more projects in the works and so on. Let's not beat a dead horse. We know that the U.S. is the big guy, but Mexico has East Coast and West Coast LNG projects, which is good because when you're exporting LNG, instead of having to go around, the tip of Argentina and Chile, you can go east from Altamira project. You can go west from the Saguaro project, which is going to be quite big. So Saguaro is going to be something like 30 million tons, which is large, and again with gas from the U.S. But Mexico could begin to be a player. You have heard me say that Mexico is a lost case. I post all the time. It's not that I have a problem with Mexico, but I see their policies as very unfriendly towards the energy sector. But again, economics will drive exports of LNG from Mexico because it just makes sense.
There's a comment here, please.
Corpus Christi. Exactly. And we will see more and more projects not only being started, they will be brought into development stage because, the gas production could go up significantly from the shale patch, and it's just waiting for market signals. Even at the very low gas prices in the U.S., they make money exporting LNG, especially because of added value.
A lot of money.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Qatar. Yeah, another big player. Sure, Qatar is also growing its export capacity. Plans to add 60-some million tons a year. That's a lot, but it's still going to be trailing the U.S. by a lot. And it has basically the largest gas field in the world, I guess. The North Field. There's East 2, there's West, there's everything. It's just an incredibly large field with reserves that will carry it for tens and tens, decades and decades. But, it is still not as price competitive as the U.S., even though the field is gigantic, geologically very favorable. But production has to do with cost advantages, infrastructure, and so on. And in this case, it still is not as competitive as the U.S., but it will grow. And then there's another problem because much of that growth is not contracted. They're going to have to fight for markets. Once they get that 50, 60 million tons, they're going to have to fight for the market. Australia, you mentioned, I think. Yeah, it's a big player. Unfortunately, Australia is going nowhere. I showed in the other picture, that the expansion in Australia is nil because Australia grew like crazy and then it hit a wall because it's just not very competitive. There's a lot of political divisiveness in Australia preventing projects, cost constraints, and even production of natural gas to be liquefied into LNG is beginning to be a problem. So you will see that the large projects, yes, they're there, Oregon and Wheatstone, and so on. But other projects to come on stream, they're not going to be fast paced. And even though it has a strategically, geopolitically advantageous uh, geographical position, it can't take advantage of that. Unfortunately for Australia, it's going to be limited to under 100 million tons.
Okay.
Another player, let's see, Indonesia. I want to talk about Indonesia because, we can't just talk about the players that everybody talks about. Indonesia is set to bring on a significant LNG project. About it, it's not gigantic, 16 million tons or something like that, but it's significant for the region. And the only problem is that Indonesia is a giant country in population. It's growing, and its population, much of it is still energy poor. So the problem there is that much of that growth in LNG capacity and natural gas production may actually end up being diverted to the domestic market instead of being available for export because Indonesia is very fast growing energy demand. And even though it has other major sources, even geothermal, and we spoke about this
Yeah.
before, Indonesia is a leader in geothermal. Its demand for energy is very growing very fast, and its population is very big. So we may not see Indonesia as a large player because it may end up internalizing all of that production. But that's a problem for them because, and we've spoken about energy poverty before. Energy poverty is a very serious social concern. You have to meet the demands of the country as it develops and brings people out of poverty into higher consumption of energy per capita. Um, Argentina, I like to talk about Argentina because everybody talks about vaca muerta. Vaca muerta means dead cow. And I say that vaca muerta is dead. Basically, it's growing in production, yes. Argentina has, fantastic projects in the works. As with all things Argentine, they exaggerate, they're optimistic, and in the end, who knows? It might not go anywhere. I know Millet has made some miracles, according to some people. And so you could say, well, Argentina's turned the corner. Now it's going to grow like crazy. I doubt it. I think Vaca Muerta may grow a little bit, but the Argentine plans for 8 or 15 million tons a year, never. I mean, never in that time frame. Maybe after 2030, if Vaca Muerta resuscitates, maybe we could see that. But that's a very long shot. I've said this before in another program. It's infrastructure. Even though Vaca Muerta is fantastic resource base and
It's,
and
it's not a
production is
question.
good.
It's
Yeah,
not a question only of reserves, but
exactly.
infrastructure,
And where it is and the logistics of it and local costs
technology.
where yeah this makes developing Vaca Muerta into a large gas supplier to the coast where it can be turned into LNG
Yeah.
is wishful thinking. But of course, given enough time, maybe we'll get at least phase one, which is not very ambitious. Maybe we'll get to some part of phase two, but
But Brazil
that
intends to import from Vaca Muerta some gas, no?
well, I think that is another wishful thinking. Maybe for Argentina, not so much for Brazil, because I think Brazil will not need Vaca Muerta gas or Argentine gas or even Bolivia gas if it plays its cards right and if it can build the gas pipelines from offshore onto land, which are very expensive. But if you get some of these major players like Equinor did, if you get Exxon or Shell or BP, they will take on that as a consortium or something and be able to build it. Maybe a couple of years to build something like that. But all of
Yeah.
a sudden, you can get a pipeline that can handle over 100 million metric cubic meters a day. So those could be large projects, and they could do away with the need for Vaca Muerta gas. And if
Yeah.
Vaca Muerta eventually does have gas, or let them export LNG if they have it. Doubtful. Um, I talk about Russia. I don't want to talk about Russia, but okay. Rystad in its report said basically, I'll just read the yellow. The outlook for Russian LNG is not rosy. It has ambitious plans for 100 million metric tons, 100 million tons per year of LNG, and by 2030, and they don't see that happening. In fact, they see Russia missing that by as much as 60%. Can you
Wow.
believe that? You know,
Wow.
one thing is to be ambitious. They have the resource base, and before the war, the Ukraine war, they probably could have put that on with American and Western technology because that's all it takes, the pumping stations and so on. Now, with the sanctions, they can't use that, and they will take certainly much more than 10 years. So you're talking 2035, not
Yeah.
2030. Eventually, it will be on because the gas is there, and you can start developing Chinese technology
Yeah.
or somewhere else. But
Okay.
forget Russia is not
Yeah.
growing anyway. That's bad for them, and the world market can certainly take that because there's plenty of production going on stream from other countries, luckily for the world gas market. But this is important, LNG in Africa, because Africa actually has several countries that are important in LNG. Some of the major exporters, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, are probably going to be LNG players in the future. I don't see them growing a lot because of major geopolitical problems, instability, country risk, but they will continue to be major players because they're right there underneath Europe. All they have to do is cross the Mediterranean. So it's very competitive in logistical terms.
Is
But
this associated gas or is
is this what?
associated gas with oil?
Uh, this is legacy production from Algeria oil field, gas fields, um, Libya gas fields, and Egypt gas from Israel turned into LNG. I don't
Okay.
think that a lot of it is associated. So it's mostly natural gas
Standalone.
production. But the fact that they have very positive, favorable aspects for
Yeah.
European exports, still they don't get to grow very much. The growth will be mostly West Africa, East Africa. West Africa, Nigeria can grow a lot. The problem with Nigeria has been security in its
Yeah.
provinces, country risk, and so on.
Very
Those are
complicated.
major challenges. It's very difficult to overcome that. If you have a technical challenge, eventually you get
Yeah.
some of the suppliers to take care of it. If you
Yeah.
have internal strife and revolt, that's very difficult to handle,
Yeah.
and that's
Okay.
Nigeria's problem. But it could be a very large player. Equatorial Guinea, maybe a small project, it could grow. The Mauritania Senegal project start small. The second phase could grow. Maybe it could even grow from other countries um, in the West African region. But if you go east, Mozambique and Tanzania, they have large resource bases that could and have large LNG projects in the works. Rovuma, I don't know how they pronounce it, is 18 million tons. In Tanzania, it's 15 million ton project. They're big projects, and they could even increase that if they had the go ahead. But even big players like Exxon and so on, they have to be very wary because they put everything on hold during the strife, and even in the capital there was strife. I have personal acquaintances and family who lived that first place in Mozambique. Strife is a disaster for any of these projects. So even though they could be very important export players, and it would be very important for the development of those countries because they are poor countries and they could benefit significantly from those exports. That may be something that will get delayed, maybe by 5 years, maybe more. And the others are small players. So basically, sure, there's other players in Asia and so on, but and I didn't talk about demand side. I'm talking about LNG projects on exports. But you see that we have a very dispersed LNG presence in the world, and that helps the overall market because you have a very good balance or a distributed balance. Yeah, if I needed to put some conclusions, yeah, there's a relative balance, less price volatility, price weakness, maybe with some of these large projects coming
Yeah.
on, maybe could be a little weak, but longer term, demand catches up from China, from even Africa, Asia. The supply demand is supported by market prices, not by Trump or by Chinese
Okay.
reindustrialization policies. And it's certainly a very flexible energy alternative, so that drives demand. And even something that we did not believe even a few years ago, China substituting some coal with natural gas from LNG, that is beginning to happen because there's many old coal plants that may be more advantageous to just
Okay.
mothball and import LNG. Some of the newer coal plants, they're not going to do away with for a long time, and they're even building new coal plants. But there are some substitutions, and that's basically the story, capillarity. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, but do not forget the first
Yeah,
question from Pedro Moura,
yeah,
considering the current concerns about carbon emissions, is the process of LNG commercially viable?
yeah. You see, LNG is energy intensive. Intensive in producing liquefaction wastes a lot of energy, and regas wastes a lot of energy. Some projects try to use that energy again, and so on. That's helps
Yeah.
the bad
So
inefficiency, but it's expensive.
it's expensive but viable.
But viable. That's the thing. And even prone for carbon capture and storage because when you burn LNG
Yeah.
in a electric generating plant, you are able to capture that in countries that decide that they want to do that. Many don't, but it is possible to do that. It's
Yeah.
still very viable.
Yeah. But Professor, LNG is a key part of the transition, energy transition,
As a
replacing
matter of fact,
coal,
yeah.
replacing other
As a
things.
matter of
But
fact, 2 years
how
ago,
do you compare the attractiveness of
yeah,
LNG compared
two
to
years
nuclear
ago,
and other
or,
things like that?
or 1.5 years ago, I think you and I spoke about the energy transition and the place for coal and LNG.
Yeah.
And back then, I was a little bit less optimistic on LNG taking some of the space of coal. Nowadays, I am a little bit more optimistic that LNG will make inroads against coal. Now, coal will still increase for some time, so it's not like it's a rosy future scenario, but now we see that LNG can and is substituting alternative energy, conventional fossil fuels. So this is a major turnaround for the energy transition, much more so than wind farms in Europe or solar farms in the U.S.
Yeah. Considering the supply chain of LNG from natural gas reserves to the delivery for the end user, which part is more expensive? Gasification, transportation, regasification,
Yeah,
to compare to natural gas?
yeah. In most cases, it's the gas supply that is considerably more expensive than it is from the U.S. Many countries have standard gas prices 3 times that of the U.S. 3 times, not 30% more. Now, that, of course, is very uneconomic for those projects. On the other hand, the fixed liquefaction and regas capital costs, which are significant, but they are capital costs, they get amortized, good well-built plants can amortize that, and it gets
It depends of the
yeah.
volume
Yeah,
transported.
and with good projects above 1-2 million tons a year, they are economic, and the facilities are very technologically advanced nowadays. Very efficient compression. Like I said, some facilities, especially in cold places or warm places, can use the heat or the cold generated to improve the energy balance.
Yeah. Going to the conclusions, please let me share that Russia is considering using submarines to transport LNG, as the US is sanctioning normal ships
Yeah.
vessels transportation.
But you see, I think this is good because I think it's funny. I think they're basically along the same lines as Argentina, wishful thinking, pie in the sky. These things won't happen. Anybody can have a project out there to do this, but no,
Okay,
the realities are the
it's
efficient
funny.
and the cost effective and the viable LNG is with LNG vessels from
Okay,
established producers that we mentioned. Nothing
and
else.
yeah, the final question for you, please. When Canada will be observed by United States?
LNG won't change that. So whenever that is, it's not going to be because of LNG or natural gas or
Yeah,
oil pipelines.
other reasons.
And I would suggest you wait while sitting.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Cleveland Jones.
It was great. Thanks a lot. Take
Thank
care,
you.
Kabani.
Take care, too.